So as this course has gone on, we've looked at different types of exceptions that you can have in Python. We've looked at value errors, you can have type errors, you can have divide by zero errors. There's actually a whole list of different type of exceptions or errors that can occur. And what we're going to do is look at creating our own types of exceptions. And this is relevant at this point because it turns out that exceptions are objects. All right, so we're going to start by defining a class time. The simplest type of class you can define. So we're just going to put a pass here, and then later on we'll define time to have hours, minutes, and seconds. And then we're going to define a type of exception for time. And this is the generic type of exception you can have. So instead of having a value error or something like that, we just define it to be of type exception. And it's just a class. So time error is going to be an error in our time class. And what we're doing is saying that there's an exception class that's already built that is a type of exception. And we want time error to have some of the same basic building blocks as exception. So we haven't looked at passing in parameters to classes yet, but this is one way that you can do that, is build your class on top of an existing class. So we don't have to do anything because exception already has all the stuff built into it that we need. All we're doing is basically giving it a different name. So we're going to write two functions related to class. One is validate time and the other is print time. And validate time just checks to see if the hours are in between 0 and 24, the minutes are in between 0 and 60, and the seconds are in between 0 and 60. And if they're not, we're going to raise a time error. Okay, so that's our class up above. And otherwise, we're going to just return true. We actually don't need this return true statement, but I just have a problem with having an if without an else in it. So this raise command, this is new for us, just means that we are now going to have an exception that's happened. And the exception is, again, that we have an invalid time format. And then I'm going to come down here and look at print time to see how this is handled. So print time is going to take an object of type time class, just like validate time did. And notice again that because we're passing this in as a parameter, as we discussed in the previous video, I put underscore class at the end of it, just to let anybody reading this know what's going on. And then I can do a try except block on time class. So I can try to validate time. And if this ends up throwing an error, then we'll go to the except and catch the time error. Otherwise, we're just going to print out the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. And if there's an exception, we're just going to print your time is an invalid type. So I'm going to try calling print time with two different times. The first one is a valid kind of time, and the second one is not. And so let's see what happens. So the first one is a valid time, and it just prints out the hours, minutes, and seconds. And the second one is an invalid type. So when it goes to validate time, then it goes through here, finds that is an invalid type, and raises a time error, which then gets caught down here in the exception block. So again, this is automatically an exception because I've declared time error to be a class that brings in all the attributes, if you will, of a pre-existing exception type. So in object-oriented programming parlance, it's inheritance. It's inherited some of the attributes. Oops. Got a copy-paste error in this block. I don't need to be author cooked twice. Okay. This is basically the same code as we just looked at. The only difference here is that in raise time error, I've put in a message. Your times are invalid. And this is a good idea. You should always put a message in with your raise time error. And I'm going to show you why. So down here, there is another difference in print time. In the previous version of this, in print time, we had a try except block. and this except trapped the time error, and then we handled the time error by printing out this little message. But if somebody runs validate time and doesn't trap that error message, then it's going to throw an exception, and we're going to get all kinds of red bits. So what I want to do is show you why it's a good idea to always have a little message in here. Although I'm probably going to break that in the next statement in the next program. All right, so let's run this and see what happens. And so because we don't have a try except block, this first is a valid time, so that gets printed out. And then down here, time 2 is not a valid time. So when we go to validate this time, it throws an exception. And so we get all this error messaging out. And because we haven't trapped that in a try except block, then we get all these messages. And here's where your times are invalid. That's printed out. So if you are creating a class and then you're creating your own exceptions for that class, you should have some little message in case somebody else is using your code and forgets to, or doesn't maybe not forgets to, but just doesn't trap your exceptions. In that case, who's ever running the program at least will get some kind of error message. Okay, and then one more usage of exceptions. So again, we have the class time. And before we use the generic exception class, really you should try to find an existing exception that's as close to the type of exceptions that you're creating as possible. So in our case, I think we have a value error. So I'm going to actually create 3 different types of exceptions: hours error, minutes error, and seconds error, and all of those are going to inherit from type value error. Doesn't make a huge difference, but just, a little better style maybe. And then in validate time, if the hours are off, I'm going to raise an hours error. Oh, and I did print the message in here, even though I don't end up using it. And if the minutes are off, I'm going to raise a minutes error. And if the seconds are off, I'm going to raise a seconds error. So just another way to maybe use exceptions. And then again, I have the else return true. I just feel like I should return something or do something in this case. Anyways, down here in print time, now I'm going to try to validate the time. And if it's a valid time, I'll print out the hours, minutes, and seconds. And then in the exception block, I'm going to trap the 3 different kinds of exceptions that we can have: an hours error, a minutes error, or a seconds error. And I'm going to print out, based on the different types of exceptions we get, whether the hours, the minutes, or the seconds are out of range. And notice that I actually don't use these strings anywhere. So you're not going to see, I actually put your hours out of control, just minutes are out of control, seconds are out of control. It's not normally kind of message I would put in there, but I put those in there that way so that we can see that those actually don't get used. But again, it's a good idea to have those in there in case somebody else uses your code and there's some kind of error raised and you get something that looks like this. Okay, so now we're going to run this code. And we'll run raising exceptions part 2. And what I've done is I've got 3 different times here. The first time is a valid time, so it just prints it out: hours, minutes, seconds. The second time has an invalid hours, so the hours are out of range, and it prints out the hours are 32. And time 3, the minutes are out of range, and in time 4, the seconds are out of range. Okay, so just some ways to use exceptions in Python. In Python, exceptions are used a little bit differently than maybe in other languages, and you can build your own kinds of exceptions. That is an object, and that object can be simply built using built-in exceptions that already exist.